Forget everything you think you know about ancient Rome. Forget the marble, forget the togas, forget the senators with their careful speeches and the emperors on their gilded thrones. Forget the gladiators and the triumphal arches and the long, sweeping drama of an empire that stretched from Scotland to the sands of Mesopotamia. All of that is real. All of that happened. But tonight, we are going somewhere else entirely. We are going to the third floor of a building on the Aventine Hill in Rome around 100 CE, the reign of the Emperor Trajan, the moment when the Roman Empire is at the absolute peak of its size and power. We are going to a room that is barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a small wooden chest. The walls are thin, the ceiling is low. The window is a single small opening covered in oiled cloth rather than glass, because glass windows in rooms like this one are a luxury that the person sleeping here cannot afford. The smell coming through that window is extraordinary, not in a good way. Rome at night smells of smoke from 1,000 cook fires and lamps, of the animal dung that coats the unpaved side streets despite the best efforts of the aediles, the city's maintenance officials, of the contents of the chamber pots that residents of buildings like this one empty from their upper floor windows after dark, aiming for the street below with varying degrees of accuracy, of the river Tiber on a warm night, which is a smell best not examined too closely, and underneath all of it, if you catch the right moment, the faint yeasty warmth of a bakery beginning its work somewhere nearby. This is Rome. Not the Rome of postcards and films, the real one. And it is loud, even now at 3 in the morning, because the city of Rome has a noise problem that its own citizens complained about loudly and in writing. And that has come down to us, in the words of the poet Juvenal, who wrote sometime around 100 CE, right around the time and place we are standing, that it was impossible to sleep in the city because of the racket of the wagons on the streets at night. The wagons. Because Rome had a rule, one of the first traffic regulations in human history, that prohibited wheeled vehicles from entering the city's streets during daylight hours to prevent the gridlock that would otherwise make the densest urban center in the ancient world completely impassable. The carts and wagons that supplied the city with food, building materials, and goods from the port at Ostia were only permitted to move through the streets after dark. And so every night, without fail, Rome became a thundering, clattering, shouting obstacle course of ox carts and delivery wagons, their iron-rimmed wooden wheels on stone paving producing a noise that Juvenal compared, only slightly hyperbolically, to that of a collapsing building. The drivers shouted at each other, the oxen protested, the loads shifted and scraped. And above it all, in their thin-walled apartments stacked 6 and 7 stories into the smoky Roman sky, the citizens of the greatest city in the world lay on their sleeping mats and tried with limited success to get some rest. Let's talk about where they lived, because before we can understand anything else about ordinary Roman life, we need to understand the insula. The insula, plural insulae, was the apartment building of ancient Rome. And calling it an apartment building is both accurate and somewhat misleading, because the insulae of Rome were simultaneously more extraordinary and more terrible than any apartment building most of us have ever entered. By 150 CE, the city of Rome had a population of somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people, packed into an area roughly the size of a small modern city. This was, by the standards of the ancient world, almost incomprehensible density. To house that many people, the Romans had developed the multi-story residential building centuries before any other civilization in the Western world attempted anything similar. The insulae rose high. Most were 3 to 5 stories. Some pushed 6, 7, even 8 stories into the Roman sky, at a time when the tallest buildings in most of the world's cities were 2 stories at most. The emperors Augustus and Nero both enacted laws limiting the height of insulae after a series of catastrophic collapses, setting maximum heights first at 70 Roman feet and later at 60. These laws were widely ignored. Landlords built as high as they thought they could get away with, because every additional floor meant additional rent. And Rome had a great many landlords. The insulae were first and foremost investment properties. Wealthy Romans, including at various points in history Cicero and Julius Caesar himself, owned insulae as income-generating assets, renting the apartments floor by floor, room by room, to the urban population that had no other option. The economics of Roman real estate were almost modern in their cynicism. The ground floor apartments were largest and most desirable, with proper rooms and occasionally a private toilet, and rented for the highest prices. As you climbed higher, the rooms got smaller, the ceilings got lower, the air got worse, the water got further away, and the rent got cheaper. The very top floors, 6, 7 stories up, were the cheapest of all, and therefore the most crowded, and therefore the most dangerous, because if the building caught fire, an insulae caught fire with depressing regularity, the people on the top floors had the furthest to run and the least time to do it. Fire was the great terror of the Roman insular dweller. There was no kitchen in most upper-floor apartments. There was no running water. There was certainly no fireplace. The structural weight and fire risk of a hearth on an upper floor of a poorly built 6-story building would have been immediately obvious to anyone. And yet people needed to cook, or at least to heat food, and so they used small portable braziers, clay or metal containers filled with burning charcoal, which they balanced on whatever surfaces were available in their tiny rooms, in buildings whose walls and floors were often held together more by habit than by sound engineering. Fires started, buildings burned, people died. This was so common, so predictable, and so profitable for certain parties, that the Romans developed what is almost certainly the first private fire insurance scheme in history, and almost certainly also the first insurance fraud. There are court records preserved for us in the legal texts that the Romans kept with extraordinary thoroughness of building owners accused of deliberately setting fire to their own insulae to collect the insurance payments. It seems that insurance fraud is not a modern invention. Let's meet someone who lives here. His name is Marcus. Not a senator's Marcus, not a general's Marcus, just Marcus, a freedman, which means he was born a slave, or his father was, and he or his father was at some point granted or purchased his freedom. He is perhaps 35 years old. He works as a copyist, one of the many people who made a living in Rome by writing out copies of documents, letters, and books by hand, since Rome had no printing press, and everything that needed to be duplicated required a human being sitting with a pen and an ink pot, copying word by word. He lives on the 4th floor. His room is small enough that if he stands in the center and stretches his arms, he can nearly touch both walls. He has a sleeping mat that rolls up during the day, a wooden chest with a lock, cheap lock, the kind that keeps out the honest, not the determined, holding his good tunic, a small bronze oil lamp, and a pouch with his savings, a low wooden table, a stool. On the wall, a small painted image of the Lares, the household gods, in a niche scratched into the plaster, because even in a rented room barely large enough to turn around in, a Roman man keeps his gods close. He does not cook in this room. He cannot cook in this room. He eats every meal outside of it. This is the fact about ordinary Roman life that most surprises people when they first encounter it. The majority of Romans, the great mass of the city's population living in the upper floors of insulae, did not cook their own food, not because they didn't know how, not because they didn't want to, because the physical realities of their housing made it nearly impossible. No kitchen, no hearth, No safe way to have an open fire in a room that shared thin walls with a dozen other rooms, in a building held together with the Roman equivalent of a prayer and a favorable structural survey. And so Rome developed something extraordinary in response: the thermopolium. The thermopolium was Rome's fast food restaurant. Not a metaphorical fast food restaurant, an actual, literal, recognizable precursor to modern street food and quick-service dining, operating on principles that any modern food court would understand immediately. The name comes from the Greek for hot things for sale, and that is exactly what it was: a counter-service establishment typically built into the ground floor of a building or along the street frontage, where prepared hot food was kept warm in large earthenware containers set into stone counters, and sold directly to customers who ate standing at the counter or took their food away. We know exactly what they looked like because Pompeii has preserved them. When Vesuvius buried the city in 79 CE, it covered at least 80 thermopolia in the city alone. 80 in a city far smaller than Rome. Their stone counters, their embedded food containers, their painted menus on the walls, the charred remains of their last meals. All of it frozen in volcanic ash and excavated nearly 2,000 years later. One thermopolium excavated in the early 2020s even had the remains of its last menu still present in the containers. Duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, and what appears to have been a kind of pork and bean stew. Duck, pig, goat, snails. This was fast food. This was what Marcus ate on his way to work. The street life of Rome was dense with food. Vendors sold bread from baskets, sausages cooked on portable grills, roasted chestnuts. Wine diluted with water, always diluted, because drinking undiluted wine was considered somewhat barbaric, a thing that northern peoples did. Olives, pickled vegetables, hard-boiled eggs. If you lived in a Roman insula and you were hungry, you did not go to your own kitchen. You went downstairs and into the street, and the street fed you. Now, dawn is breaking. The wagon traffic that made the night unbearable is finally subsiding. The last carts rumbling out through the city gates before the prohibition takes effect again with the first light. The streets are already filling with the early risers. Rome woke early, almost universally, because the working day front-loaded itself into the cooler morning hours, and the light of the afternoon was for other things. Marcus rolls up his sleeping mat. He puts on his tunic, a simple woolen garment, belted at the waist, the standard daily wear of the Roman working man, not a toga. The toga, despite its fame, was not everyday wear. It was formal, ceremonial, heavily impractical for any actual work. A long, awkwardly draped length of wool that required significant skill to put on correctly and had a tendency to unravel itself at inconvenient moments. Citizens wore togas to the forum for official business, to legal proceedings, to religious ceremonies. They did not wear them to the bakery. Marcus has a toga. It is folded carefully in his chest. He takes it out perhaps twice a month. He washes his face and hands at the public fountain 2 buildings down. There is no water on his floor, and carrying water 4 flights up is exhausting enough that it is rationed for drinking and cooking, not casually spent on morning ablutions. He joins the stream of people heading toward the forum and the various business districts, exchanging nods with the baker whose shop is on the ground floor of his building, pausing to buy a round of bread and a small cup of sour wine from a street vendor. Breakfast in Rome is a serious minimalist event. Bread, maybe some olives or a piece of cheese, or a hard-boiled egg if you are flush. Wine watered down to the consistency of not quite wine. The Romans ate their real meals later in the day, and breakfast was understood as fuel rather than pleasure. A thing you put in your body so that it kept working, not a thing you lingered over. Marcus eats as he walks, because Rome is not a city of leisurely mornings for people who work for their income, and he has a commission waiting, a long legal document that needs to be copied by the 5th hour, roughly hour 11 in the morning, and the client does not appreciate delays. The city moves around him. Let's look at that city, because Rome at its height was something that most of its own inhabitants probably never fully processed, because you can't process 1,000,000 people all at once. You process it the way you always process a city, in fragments, in the immediate radius of your own life, in the familiar faces at the fountain, and the regular vendors at the corner, and the specific sounds of your own street at the specific hours of your own day. But from above, from the kind of perspective none of its residents could ever have had, the city was staggering. 1,000,000 people in a space where 1,000,000 people had no real right to fit. Streets so narrow that 2 loaded carts could not pass each other. Buildings of 6 and 7 stories, creating canyons of shade in the lower streets that never saw direct sunlight. And then, suddenly, breaking out of those canyons into an open space, the Forum Romanum, the beating heart of the city, where the temples and basilicas and rostra stood in the morning light, and where the city's official life was conducted with the self-important formality that Romans brought to their public rituals. Rome was a city of extraordinary contrasts in space. A tenement, dark and reeking on one street, a porticoed garden open to the sky on the next. A neighborhood of workshops and taverns and the smell of tanneries, 3 minutes walk away, the vast, perfumed, lavishly appointed public baths. The baths. We'll get to those. They deserve their own moment. For now, the streets. The streets of Rome were, frankly, a disaster that the Romans managed with impressive ingenuity, but never quite solved. The main thoroughfares were paved with large basalt blocks, thick and durable, worn smooth by centuries of feet and hooves. The side streets were often unpaved. Drainage was partial. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was one of the engineering wonders of the ancient world, but it didn't reach everywhere, and the parts it didn't reach handled their waste in the way that densely populated cities, without infrastructure, have always handled their waste, which is to say, badly. There were raised stepping stones at street crossings, set with specific spacing to allow cartwheels to pass between them, so that pedestrians could cross without descending into the muck that collected in the roadway. We have found these stones in Pompeii, still in place, still perfectly spaced. You can walk across them today. You are doing exactly what a Roman shopkeeper did 2,000 years ago, stepping from stone to stone above the gutter. The streets were also, and this detail appears repeatedly in the Roman writers who commented on urban life, extremely noisy even by day. Metal hammering from workshops, vendors crying their wares, students at outdoor schools reciting their lessons loudly, as ancient students did, because memorization was performed by speaking aloud. Dogs, beggars, arguing neighbors. The hoarse, operatic shouting of the man who sold hot sausages from a portable grill, and whose advertising technique appeared to consist of simply shouting sausages at maximum volume continuously from dawn to dusk. This was the soundscape of the world's greatest city, magnificent, exhausting, completely, entirely human. Marcus reaches his client's house by the 2nd hour of the day. He settles into the small room that has been set aside for his work, a copying room with a good north-facing window for steady light, a sloped writing surface, ink and reed pens already set out. The document he is copying is a land sale, pages of careful legal Latin that he will reproduce in his best hand, because legal documents need to be legible, and his reputation depends on his legibility. He works in silence. Outside, the city continues its roar. He does not notice it anymore. You stop noticing it after a while. It becomes the background noise of your life, the way rain on a roof becomes background noise, or traffic, or the specific frequency of the city you have always lived in. Rome is just the sound of Rome, and within that sound, in the fourth-floor room on the Aventine, in the stepping stones over the gutter, in the thermopolium with its duck and pork and snails, in the wagon wheels on stone at 3 in the morning, in the baker beginning his work before dawn, in the vendor shouting about sausages, in all of it, a civilization, the largest and most complex that the Western world had yet produced, built not by emperors alone, built by the million ordinary people who got up every morning, washed their faces at a public fountain, bought bread from a cart, and went to work. It was built by Marcus. It was built by all the Marcuses. And their story, the real story of Rome, the one that the marble and the triumphal arches don't quite tell, is what we're here for tonight. So settle in. The wagon wheels have faded. The city is finding its morning rhythm. Pour yourself something warm if you have it. We're just getting started. And before we continue, if you're enjoying this journey into the real world of ancient Rome, you're in exactly the right place. This is Sleepy History Tales, where we go deep into the real lives of ordinary people across history. The ones history books skip over, the ones who did the actual work. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and the bell, and you'll never miss a story. If you've been here before, thank you. You're the reason we keep going. Now, back to Rome. There is a smell that every Roman knew. Every soldier on a frozen frontier in Britain, every senator reclining at a dinner in a marble-floored villa, every dockworker unloading amphorae at Ostia, every child running through the streets of the Subura, Rome's densest, noisiest, most chaotic neighborhood, every slave, every freedman, every baker, every prostitute, every gladiator, every priest. They all knew this smell. It was not a pleasant smell, not by any modern standard. Contemporary Romans who wrote about it used words that translate roughly as intensely pungent, powerfully aromatic, and, in the case of the philosopher Seneca, who was never one to soften an opinion, the overpriced guts of rotten fish. And yet, every single one of them ate it regularly, enthusiastically, at breakfast, at dinner, at the thermopolium counter at midday, in their military rations, in their medicine, drizzled over their vegetables and stirred into their stews and mixed into their wine, and used as a condiment, a preservative, a cooking base, and, according to Pliny the Elder, who approached the subject with the thoroughness he brought to everything, a treatment for dog bites, earaches, and dysentery. This was garum, and garum was Rome. Let's understand what it actually was, because the reality is both more disgusting and more interesting than the summary suggests. Garum was fermented fish sauce. To make it, you took fish, whole small fish like anchovies, mackerel and sardines, or the guts and organs of larger fish, the parts that would otherwise be thrown away, and you layered them in enormous stone or concrete vats with very large quantities of salt. Then you left the vats in the Mediterranean sun for anywhere from a few weeks to 3 months, during which time the natural enzymes in the fish tissue broke down the proteins. The heat accelerated the fermentation, and the entire mass slowly liquefied into a dark, intensely flavored liquid that rose to the top of the vat and was carefully skimmed off and transferred to clay amphorae for storage and transport. The process was, in straightforward terms, controlled decomposition. The smell during production was so powerful that the factories, the ceteriae as the Romans called them, were required by law to be built outside city limits, because no neighborhood wanted a garum factory nearby. We know this not from ancient law codes, but from the simple fact that archaeologists have consistently found garum production facilities on the outskirts of ancient Roman towns, never in their centers. The smell preceded the product by considerable distance. And yet the finished product, aged and bottled and shipped across the empire in its distinctive sealed amphorae, was not merely acceptable, it was extraordinary. Ancient garum had a full-bodied and rich umami flavor, savory and complex in exactly the way that modern soy sauce and Southeast Asian fish sauce are savory and complex. Because that is, at bottom, what garam was: a fermented protein sauce rich in glutamates, capable of adding a depth and intensity of flavor to food that no amount of fresh herbs or olive oil could replicate. The Romans understood this intuitively, even without the vocabulary of flavor chemistry. They used garum the way a modern cook uses salt or soy sauce or Worcestershire, not as a flavor in itself, but as an amplifier of other flavors, a thing that made everything it touched more itself. Garum was as ubiquitous as ketchup in the ancient world. More than that, actually, because ketchup is optional and garum was structural. Take it out of Roman cooking and the cuisine doesn't just taste different. It barely exists. Now here is the detail about garum that stops people cold when they hear it. It came in grades, like wine, like olive oil, like any luxury product in any sophisticated culinary culture. The cheapest grade, called alec, was the solid residue left in the vat after the good liquid had been skimmed off. It was a thick, salty, powerfully flavored paste, and it was what the poorest Romans used to season their porridge and their bread. Nutritious, intensely salty, and not something you lingered over. The middle grades were the everyday cooking garums, used in the thermopolia, in military rations, in the kitchens of the working and middle classes. These were good, functional products, reliable in quality, available everywhere, priced so that even the urban poor could afford a small amphora. And then there was garum sociorum, the garum of the Allies. This was the apex of the product. Made primarily from mackerel, produced on the coast of what is now southern Spain, this particular garum was praised by Pliny the Elder in terms that put its quality on par with the finest perfumes and unguents, an extraordinary comparison that tells you everything about how seriously the Romans took their fish sauce. Garum sociorum was eye-wateringly expensive. A small amphora could cost more than a laborer earned in a month. It was a gift between elites, a status symbol, something you served at a dinner party to demonstrate that you could afford it. A freed slave named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus became so wealthy from the garum trade that he built himself a magnificent house in Pompeii, decorating the floor of his atrium with a mosaic of garum amphorae that functioned essentially as a brand advertisement in stone. The man made his fortune selling fermented fish guts. He was proud enough of it to put it on his floor. This is Rome. This is exactly Rome. But let's leave the sauce for a moment and talk about the bread. Because if garum was the flavor of Rome, bread was its foundation, in a way that was both literal and formally political. Rome at its height was feeding close to 1 million people in a single city, most of whom did not grow their own food, most of whom did not have kitchens, and most of whom depended for their survival on the functioning of supply chains that stretched across the entire Mediterranean world. Grain came from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily. The great bread baskets of the empire, their fields worked by slaves and tenant farmers, their harvests loaded onto merchant ships at Carthage and Alexandria and Ostia, and carried to Rome in a continuous river of food that, if interrupted for any significant period, would have produced starvation on a catastrophic scale. The Roman state understood this and responded with one of the most extraordinary welfare programs in the ancient world. The annona. The annona was the grain dole, the system by which the Roman state distributed free or heavily subsidized grain directly to a significant portion of the city's population. By the time of the emperors, somewhere between 150,000 and 320,000 Roman male citizens were receiving regular grain distributions from the state, enough to provide a substantial portion of their caloric needs for the year. Free grain from the government, distributed at specific points around the city on a regular schedule to hundreds of thousands of people. This is not charity in the modern sense. It was a political calculation of cold brilliance. Keeping the urban poor of Rome fed was not generosity, it was survival for the ruling class. A hungry Rome was a dangerous Rome. The phrase that has come down to us from the poet Juvenal, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, captures the cynicism of it perfectly. Give the people food and entertainment, and they will not riot. Keep them fed and distracted, and the emperors can do more or less as they please. It worked more or less for centuries. The bread that Romans ate was not the soft, pale, airy bread of modern experience. Roman bread was dense, chewy, and nutritious, much closer to a modern sourdough or whole-grain loaf than to anything you'd find pre-sliced in a supermarket. It was made from various grades of grain, the finest white bread from high-quality sifted flour reserved for the wealthy, darker, coarser bread from less processed flour for the middle classes, and the darkest, densest bread of all, made from the lowest grades of grain, including what we would now call bran, for the poor. We know exactly what Roman bread looked like because Pompeii once again preserved it. In the bakeries buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, archaeologists have found carbonized loaves of bread still sitting in their ovens, perfectly circular, divided into 8 sections by a series of impressions made before baking, so that the bread could be broken cleanly into portions. These loaves are so immediately recognizable as bread, the round shape, the scored surface, the dense crumb visible in the cross-sections, that they appear in photographs, almost like something you might find in a modern artisan bakery. They are not. They are 2,000 years old, and they are indistinguishable in form from something baked this morning. Roman cuisine was built on grain in all its forms. Pulse, a thick porridge made from spelt barley or wheat, was an essential item, the oldest and most fundamental Roman food, what the legions lived on for centuries before bread became the standard. The transition from porridge to bread was, in its way, a marker of Roman urbanization. Porridge was peasant food, field food, soldier food. Bread was city food, a product of the specialized bakeries that Rome needed to feed its urban millions. By the time of the Empire, Rome had more than 200 professional bakeries operating within the city, not home bakers, not occasional bread makers, dedicated commercial operations, some of them quite large, with multiple mills, multiple ovens, multiple shifts of workers, producing hundreds of loaves a day. The flour was milled on site, ground by rotating millstones turned by donkeys walking in circles in the back of the bakery, hour after hour, their eyes sometimes blindfolded so that the endless circular path didn't disorient them. The combination of a major state grain distribution and a professional bakery industry meant that a poor Roman in the city could be fed reasonably well on a daily basis. Bread from the annona, or bought cheaply from a bakery, supplemented by whatever could be purchased at the Thermopolium or from street vendors. It was not a luxurious life, but it was a fed one. Let's go back to Marcus. It's the middle of the day, what the Romans called the 6th hour, roughly noon, and Marcus has finished his morning's work, the land sale copied out in his careful hand and delivered to his client's steward. He has a few hours before the afternoon's work begins, and he does what most Romans do at midday. He eats. He stops at a Thermopolium 2 streets from his client's house, not the one he went to this morning, a different one, closer to the Forum, where the menu painted on the wall advertises lentil stew, a pork sausage, and what appears to be a small amphora of a reasonably decent local wine. The counter is busy. 3 or 4 people are eating, standing up, bowls in hand, leaning against the painted wall with the practiced ease of people who have been eating lunch at standing counters their entire lives. Marcus orders the lentil stew. It comes in a clay bowl, thick and hot, dark with the particular depth of flavor that comes from a generous hand with the garum, that irreducible savory background note that makes the lentils taste more than lentils, that makes the whole thing taste like Rome. There is a piece of bread balanced on the rim of the bowl, A small cup of wine, watered to about half strength. He eats quickly. Romans ate quickly at midday. The main meal of the day, the cena, came in the late afternoon, and the midday meal was understood as refueling rather than pleasure. He exchanges a few words with the man next to him about the weather and a chariot race that happened last week. He doesn't know the man's name. They've probably stood at this same counter before. The stew is good. The bread is solid. The wine is unremarkable. He puts his bowl on the counter, nods to the owner, a woman in her 40s who runs the thermopolium with brisk efficiency, managing the counter and the cooking and the occasional dispute between customers with the multitasking calm of someone who has been doing this for 20 years, and steps back out into the street. The 6th hour, the sun directly overhead, the city in its midday pause. Now, here is something that surprises people about the Roman relationship with food. For all that they ate at counters and bought their meals from street vendors and the thermopolia, the Romans also had deeply held views about what a proper meal looked like. And a proper meal was not eaten standing at a counter. A proper meal was eaten lying down. The Romans ate their cena, their main evening meal, reclining on couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. This was not just the habit of the wealthy, though the wealthy certainly took it to the greatest extremes of luxury and length. Even middle-class Roman families arranged their dining rooms with this orientation. The couch is called triclinia, 3 per room, the name itself meaning 3 couches. 3. Lying on your left side, propped on your left elbow, using your right hand to eat. This was the default dining position of a Roman, and it looked strange to almost every other culture in the ancient world, most of which sat upright to eat. The Romans found sitting at meals rather barbaric. Reclining, they felt, was the mark of a free person at ease in their world. Servants stood. Slaves stood. Children, until they were old enough to be considered proper participants in the social ritual of the dinner, sat on stools at the edge of the couch. But free Roman adults lay down to eat their evening meal, and they had been doing so for centuries, and they were not about to change for anyone. The dinner itself, at least for the middle and upper classes, unfolded in courses, not the multi-hour excess of peacock tongues extravaganza that popular history tends to focus on. That existed certainly at the very highest levels of wealth and status, but for the ordinary well-off Roman, a typical cena had 3 parts: the gustaccio, a starter of olives, eggs, cheese, and raw vegetables dressed with garum and olive oil; the prima mensa, the main courses, involving some combination of meat, fish, legumes, and cooked vegetables, everything seasoned with the inevitable garum; and the secunda mensa, the dessert course, which typically featured fruit, nuts, and honey. Wine throughout. Always wine, always watered. Dinner guests might enjoy pork with garum, followed by fish with garum, and wine with garum. The sauce was present at virtually every stage of a Roman meal. It was not optional. It was structural. The flavor profile of Roman food was built around garum, the way modern Italian food is built around olive oil and tomatoes. Everything else assumes it's there. One more thing about Roman food that deserves its own moment. The Romans had a hamburger. Not identical to a modern hamburger, but close enough to make you do a double take when you first encounter it in the historical record. It was called Isicia aumentata, lean meat, fish sauce, and wine combined and formed into a patty or ball, then cooked and served on bread. A recipe survives in the Roman cookbook Apicius, the oldest surviving cookbook in the Western culinary tradition, and while Isicia aumentata involved pine nuts and pepper and other seasonings that a modern burger doesn't typically include, the basic concept, ground meat formed into a patty served on bread, is unmistakable. The Romans had wine bars where people played dice and argued. They had takeout food and cooking shows and food critics and street vendors and branded products and food scams and agricultural subsidies and the ancient equivalent of fast food chains. Emperor Claudius once shut down Thermopolia across Rome to cut down on the criminal activity that congregated around them. An ancient city council closing the fast food restaurants because they were becoming gathering spots for troublemakers. Every single one of these things has a precise modern parallel. The technology changes, the ingredients change, the specific flavors change beyond recognition, but the human behavior around food, the desire for convenience, for flavor, for social eating, for comfort, for the particular pleasure of something hot and savory eaten, standing up in the middle of a busy day, that behavior does not change. It has not changed in 2,000 years, and it probably won't change for another 2,000. The afternoon is settling into its warmest hours. The streets are slightly quieter. The midday pause, when the city slows its pace, and those who can afford to rest for a while do so. A few shops have their shutters half closed. The vendor who sells sausages has found a strip of shade against a wall and is sitting with his eyes closed, the portable grill temporarily unlit beside him. Marcus is back at his writing table. The land sale is done. The afternoon commission is a batch of personal letters, 3 of them, dictated by a wealthy client who finds his own handwriting embarrassing. Marcus will copy them out in his best formal hand, the letters destined for associates in Alexandria and Antioch, carrying the routine business of empire across the sea in a sealed clay tube. He dips his reed pen. The ink is fresh and black. Outside, the city hums. Somewhere, in a kitchen behind a thermopolium 3 streets away, someone is stirring a pot of lentil stew and adding garum from a small terracotta jug. A splash of dark liquid that hits the hot surface and immediately fills the kitchen with that specific, powerful, entirely Roman smell. The smell of a civilization that ate well, argued constantly about flavor, and managed to make fermented fish guts one of the most important commodities in the ancient world. That is not a small achievement. That is, in its way, exactly the kind of achievement that civilizations should be judged by, not just the wars they won and the marble they carved, but what they put on the table at the end of a long day. And whether it was good, it was good. Trust the 2,000 years of evidence on this one. It is the 8th hour of the Roman day. By our reckoning, that is roughly 2 in the afternoon. The working morning has ended, the midday meal has been eaten, the brief siesta, the meridiatio, the Roman nap that the Mediterranean climate makes almost compulsory in the hottest months, is over. The sun is still high and the streets are still warm, but the brutal press of the morning crowds has eased. And now, as reliably as the tide, the city of Rome begins its daily migration. Everyone is going to the baths. Not some people, not the leisured class, not just the wealthy or the well-connected, everyone. It was a Roman custom to visit the baths daily, both for reasons of cleanliness and to conduct business or meet friends. A Roman emperor, asked by a foreign visitor why he bathed only once a day, is reported to have replied with cheerful impatience, "Because I do not have the time to bathe twice." The daily bath was not a luxury. It was not a treat saved for special occasions or wealthy moods. It was as fundamental to Roman daily life as bread and as automatic as breathing. To skip the baths was not merely to be dirty, it was to be somehow un-Roman, to have opted out of the central social ritual of the civilization, and the civilization had built something extraordinary to receive them. Let's stop outside the entrance to one of Rome's public thermae and simply look. The building in front of you is enormous. Not impressive for its time, enormous. Enormous by any standard, in any era. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate up to 1,600 people at one time, their halls and pools and exercise courts covering an area of 27 acres, larger than the Vatican museums. The largest of all, the baths of Diocletian, could hold up to 3,000 bathers. And these were not bare utilitarian spaces. They were lavishly decorated with precious marbles, with mosaics that covered the floors in geometric and figural patterns of dazzling intricacy, with statues in the Greek style standing in their niches, with painted ceilings vaulting over spaces so large that the air inside them had its own particular warmth and quality, different from the air outside. You enter through a colonnade, and immediately the sound of the city, the wheels, the vendors, the arguments, recedes behind you. The first room is the apoditerium, the changing room. You undress, you hand your clothes and valuables to an attendant for a small fee, or to a slave if you have brought one, which wealthy Romans typically did, and you stand there in the warm air of the changing room, completely without clothing, in a room full of other people who are also completely without clothing, and this presents absolutely no problem to anyone involved. The Romans had no particular anxiety about nudity in the baths. Nudity in the thermae was not sexual, not exhibitionistic, not embarrassing. It was simply practical. You cannot bathe properly in your clothes. The baths removed with the clothes, whatever social markers clothing provided. The communal nature of the baths allowed people of various walks of life to gather together, creating a unique space where social barriers were often blurred. The senator and the dock worker were both in the caldarium, just men in hot water. The Emperor Hadrian, one of history's great statesmen and administrators, made a point of going to the public baths rather than bathing privately in his palace. He wanted to be seen, to be known as a man of the people, accessible and ordinary in at least this one daily context. This was not unusual. In Rome, the baths were where you showed up. Now, the ritual of bathing itself. Because calling it bathing is like calling a symphony a song. It was technically accurate and entirely inadequate. A trip to the baths was an afternoon affair. You might start in the caldarium, sweating out the day's grime, then perhaps a plunge in the frigidarium to invigorate the senses, maybe a leisurely float in the tepidarium for a chat with friends, but let's go slower than that, because the details are worth savoring. You begin, after undressing in the apoditerium, with exercise. Not optional exercise, not the enthusiastic choice of the athletically inclined. Regular, expected exercise, performed before bathing as a matter of standard practice. Feeling energetic. Hit the palestra, the gym, for some wrestling, weightlifting or ball games. The palestra was an open courtyard, colonnaded, with a sand floor, where men wrestled and threw weights, and played a ball game called harpastum that was roughly analogous to a combination of handball and rugby. Exercise made you sweat. The point was to sweat. After the palestra, you moved into the bathing sequence proper. The tepidarium first. A warm, moderately heated room, designed as a transitional space between the outside world and the serious heat of the caldarium. The tepidarium was where conversations began, where business was initiated, where you settled into the particular relaxed alertness that warm air and the end of the working day produce in a person who has been on their feet since dawn. Then the caldarium, the hot room. The caldarium was heated by a hypocaust system, one of the great engineering achievements of Roman architecture, in which hot air from a furnace was circulated through a raised floor and hollow walls, creating a radiant heat that warmed the entire room from every surface simultaneously. The floor was warm, the walls were warm, the air was dense with steam. A large central pool of hot water waited, and around the edges of the room, individual basins allowed bathers to wash more carefully with water scooped from heated reservoirs. In the caldarium, you sweated thoroughly, soaked, and then, crucially, you scraped. The Romans did not use soap in the modern sense. Their cleaning method was, in its mechanics, more like exfoliation. The body was oiled, often with olive oil, sometimes with more expensive scented preparations. And then a curved metal tool called a strigil was drawn across the skin, scraping away the oil along with the dirt and dead skin cells it had loosened. A skilled bath slave could do this efficiently and without discomfort. Doing it yourself required some practice. The result was skin that was remarkably clean, perhaps more thoroughly cleaned in certain respects than soap alone achieves. And the discarded mixture of oil and skin debris collected in the strigil could be sold. There are Roman records of the scraped-off contents of athletes' strigils being sold as a medicinal preparation, believed to carry some of the athlete's strength and vitality. Someone always found a market for everything in Rome. After the caldarium, the cold plunge. The frigidarium, the cold room, was a shock after the dense heat of the caldarium, and deliberately so. A large unheated pool, often quite beautiful, decorated with mosaics and statuary, fed by cold water from the aqueduct. You went in. It was cold, extremely cold. The Romans understood, empirically and correctly, that the contrast between the heat of the caldarium and the cold of the frigidarium produced something in the body that was both physically invigorating and deeply satisfying. The specific pleasure of warmth appreciated through cold, of relaxation earned through exertion. After the frigidarium, you dried off, were oiled again, dressed, and emerged into the covered walkways and gardens of the Thermae complex to do what Romans did once the bathing itself was finished. Everything else. Because the baths were not a bathhouse. The modern equivalent would be a combination of a library, art gallery, mall, restaurant, gym, and spa. Walk out of the frigidarium and into the covered porticos, and you find food stalls selling bread and sausages and heated wine, perfume sellers, barbers who will shave you or trim your hair in the warm afternoon air, money changers, people selling snacks, scrolls, small luxury goods. Beyond the food stalls, the libraries, one important function of the baths, was their role as what we would consider a branch library today. Many in the general public did not have access to the grand libraries in Rome, and so, as a cultural institution, the baths served as an important resource where the more common citizen could enjoy the luxury of books. Books, in the bathhouse, available to the public, and beyond the libraries, stages that accommodated theatrical and musical performances, adjacent stadia that provided spaces for exercise and athletic competitions. All of this was available to anyone who paid the entry fee, which was kept deliberately low, subsidized by the state and by wealthy patrons who sponsored free entry days. Aristocratic Romans, particularly those seeking to build up popularity with the public come election time, often sponsored days where anyone could use the baths for free. The Thermae were the democratic heart of Rome, the single institution where the city came closest to being what its founding myths claimed it was, a community of free people with equal access to the good things of civilization. It was not perfect. Slaves attended their masters, women bathed separately or in different hours. The very poorest could not always afford even the minimal entry fee on a daily basis. But by the standards of the ancient world, by the standards of most of the world for most of human history, the accessibility of the Roman public baths was extraordinary. 1 million people, one city, and nearly 1,000 bathing establishments to receive them. Marcus arrives at the baths at the 8th hour. He comes to one of the smaller establishments, a balneum rather than a great imperial thermae, near the Aventine, familiar from years of daily use, its attendants known to him by name, its rhythms as comfortable as his own heartbeat. He pays his entrance coin. He undresses. He leaves his clothes with the attendant and makes a mental note, as he always does, of the young men loitering near the changing rooms, because the thieves who worked the baths were a well-known Roman hazard, patient opportunists who watched for the unattended cloak and the momentarily forgotten sandal. He does not exercise today. He is tired from the morning's copying work, his hand and shoulder aching in the particular way that comes from hours of careful small movement work, and the last thing he wants is the palaestra. He goes straight to the tepidarium. He lies down on one of the stone benches along the wall, lets the warm air settle over him, and closes his eyes. Around him, the baths do what the baths always do. They talk. The thermae were never quiet. They were not designed to be quiet. The Romans had no particular concept of silence as a desirable feature of a communal space, and the combination of hundreds of people in a large resonant building, all of them relaxed and somewhat naked, and feeling the social lubrication that warm water and the end of the working day provides, produced a continuous human noise of extraordinary variety. The philosopher Seneca, who lived above a balneum for a period and wrote about it with barely contained irritation, catalogued the sounds that rose through his floor: the grunts of men exercising, the thwack of hands being slapped against skin in the massage room, the argument about the score of the ball game, the vendor crying his wares in the corridor, someone singing badly and completely without self-consciousness, the sudden explosive splash of someone jumping into the cold pool, the shriek that followed the splash, the laughter that followed the shriek. Seneca, who was a Stoic philosopher, found all of this very trying. The other 999 people in the building found it entirely normal. Marcus lies in the warm air and lets the noise wash over him, the way city noise always washes over people who have lived in cities their whole lives, present but not intrusive, a background condition of existence rather than something to be attended to. A man he knows slightly from the neighborhood settles onto the bench beside him and says something about the weather. Marcus responds. The conversation ambles in the pleasant, directionless way of conversations between people who have nothing urgent to discuss and nowhere immediately to be. This is what the baths were for, not just for the body, for the pause. The Forum was a different kind of public space, and in many ways the opposite of the baths. Where the baths were warm and private within public, the Forum was exposed and official. Where the baths stripped away social markers, the Forum was where they were most aggressively displayed. The Forum Romanum, the original civic center of Rome, surrounded by temples and basilicas, and the rostra from which orators addressed the crowds, was the place where Rome conducted its public business. Legal proceedings, political announcements, religious ceremonies, the auctions of property and slaves that were a regular feature of Roman commercial life, the elections in the Republican period that filled the open space with the noise and jostling of the Roman people, exercising what they understood to be their sovereign right. For an ordinary Roman, the Forum was both deeply familiar and slightly intimidating, a space you passed through daily, where you knew the faces of the regular vendors and the permanent fixtures of the beggar community, but where the formal ceremonies of power also took place, where the gap between citizen and official was made visible in processions and regalia and the careful stagecraft of Roman authority. The Forum was also where lawyers worked. Roman law was an elaborate, sophisticated, and publicly accessible system, and it generated an enormous industry of legal professionals. Advocates who argued cases in the basilica, jurists, consults who gave legal opinions, notaries who drafted documents, scribes like Marcus who copied out the legal paperwork that the system produced in such extraordinary volumes. The law touched everyone. Property disputes, inheritance claims, contract violations, debt collection, criminal proceedings, and navigating it required specialists who understood its technicalities and could represent a client's interests within its rules. Some of these lawyers were extraordinarily famous. Cicero, the greatest orator Rome produced, whose collected speeches and letters have come down to us as essential texts of Latin literature, built his career in the courts of the Forum, turning the arguing of legal cases into a form of public performance art so refined that the crowds who gathered to watch a significant trial were almost indistinguishable from the crowds who gathered for the theater. Because in Rome, everything public was performance. The Roman, more than almost any other ancient person, understood intuitively that public life was theatre, that the way you presented yourself in the forum, the quality of your toga, and the confidence of your stride, and the volume and precision of your speech, all of it was being watched, evaluated, and judged. Reputation, dignitas, the Romans called it, was the currency of public life, more important than money in many contexts, easier to lose than to gain, and essentially impossible to fully recover once seriously damaged. The forum was where dignitas was made and broken. Marcus is not a man of the forum in that sense. He is not a lawyer or a senator or a man whose public reputation shapes his fate. He is a craftsman of letters, valuable, moderately prosperous, entirely obscure. He passes through the forum on his daily routes the way most Romans do, as a setting, a backdrop, a place through which you move rather than in which you perform. But he notices it. Everyone notices it. The temples shining in the late afternoon sun, the old rostra, its front decorated with the bronze rams of captured ships standing in the open space, the crows that have found a permanent residency on the roof of the Temple of Saturn, the permanent cluster of people near the law courts, the mix of the professionally anxious, clients waiting for their lawyers, and the professionally patient, the beggars who found the law courts reliably productive. He passes through. He heads home. There is one more aspect of Roman leisure that deserves a moment before we close this chapter. The Romans invented what we would now call the concept of vacation. Not merely the practical pause from work. All civilizations had those, tied to agricultural cycles or religious calendars. The Romans invented the idea of going somewhere specifically for rest and pleasure, for the restorative value of a different landscape and a slower pace. The wealthy went to their country villas, the villae rusticae, which were sometimes genuine working farms and sometimes elaborate pleasure complexes with gardens, fish ponds, heated baths and libraries maintained in the Alban Hills or on the Bay of Naples, where the air was better than Rome's, and the company more carefully chosen than the democratic chaos of the urban thermae. But even ordinary Romans went somewhere. The coast south of Rome, what is now the Lazio coast, had modest resort towns that catered to the middle-income Romans who could not afford a full villa but wanted a few days by the sea. The baths at Baiae on the Bay of Naples were famous enough to attract visitors from across the empire. Their natural hot springs and the surrounding landscape of hills and sea considered among the most beautiful in Italy. There was an understanding, fully articulated by Seneca and Cicero and others who wrote about the philosophy of daily life, that a person needed rest, genuine, deliberate, purposeful rest, to function well. Otium, the Romans called it. Leisure. Not laziness, not sloth, but the conscious, chosen pause that renewed the capacity for negotium, for business, for the serious work of life. The Romans did not feel guilty about leisure. They philosophized about it. They wrote essays about it. They built magnificent infrastructure for it. They considered a civilization that could not provide its citizens with genuine leisure to be a civilization that had failed at something fundamental. They elevated bathing to a fine art, and their bathhouses physically reflected these advancements. They built gardens and libraries and theater stages into the same buildings where they bathed. They created the first purpose-built vacation destinations in Western history. And then, every evening, they went home. Back to the fourth floor of the insula, back to the thin walls and the smell of the neighbors cooking and the knowledge that the wagons would start rumbling again at midnight. But for a few hours, in the warm air of the tepidarium, in the cold shock of the frigidarium, in the late afternoon gardens of the thermae with a cup of wine and a conversation that went nowhere in particular. For a few hours, the city was perfect. The trick was knowing how to find those hours. The Romans, at their best, knew. The sun is moving toward the western hills now. Marcus has collected his clothes from the attendant, tipped the bath slave who scraped him down with the strigil, and is making his way home through streets that are taking on the amber quality of late afternoon. He stops at a wine bar he knows, a taberna with a few stone benches outside, the owner serving from a large amphora into clay cups. The wine already mixed with water in the correct ratio and tasting of the particular hills south of Rome where it was grown. He sits. Around him the city is adjusting its rhythm from the pace of the working day to the pace of the evening. Voices are easier. Laughter comes more readily. The sharp edges of the morning, the commission, the client, the deadline, have been worn smooth by the warm water and the afternoon pause. He drinks his wine slowly. The crows on the temple roof have found something to argue about. A child runs through the street below, chasing something, a ball, a dog, a pure abstract motion, and disappears around a corner. Somewhere in the building behind him, someone is cooking. The smell of it, garlic and olive oil and something meaty browning over a charcoal flame, drifts out over the street and into the warm evening air. Rome, just Rome, at its most ordinary, and therefore at its most itself. There is a tomb in Rome that most visitors walk past without stopping. It sits near the Porta Maggiore, one of the ancient gates of the city, and it is, by the standards of Rome's funerary monuments, unusual. Not beautiful exactly, not modest either. It is large, and it is built to be noticed, and it is shaped like a baker's oven, not metaphorically, literally. The tomb of Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces is constructed in the form of the cylindrical kneading machines used in Roman commercial bakeries, stacked and combined into an architectural monument that is both deeply strange and completely intentional. Eurysaces wanted you to know exactly what he was, what he had done, what had made him the man wealthy enough to build a tomb that has lasted 2,000 years. He was a baker, a freed slave who became a baker, then a bread supplier to the Roman state, then rich enough to be buried in a monument that still stands on a busy Roman street, his name and profession carved into the stone in letters you can still read today. Eurysaces, baker, free man. His tomb outlasted the emperors. This chapter is about him, and about the thousands of people whose stories ran parallel to his, people who existed in the space between slave and citizen that Rome created and that no other civilization in the ancient world managed in quite the same complicated, uncomfortable, and in some ways extraordinary way. Let's be clear about something before we go any further. Roman slavery was not something to romanticize. It was a system of profound, institutionalized cruelty that treated human beings as property, that subjected them to violence and degradation, that separated families and denied people the most basic autonomy over their own lives. The Roman slave had no legal existence as a person. They could not marry legally, could not own property in their own name, could not refuse their owner's commands, could not protect themselves or their children from any abuse the owner chose to inflict. The law designated slaves as res, things, and while there were occasional legal protections against the most extreme cruelty, these were inconsistently applied and largely dependent on the character of the individual owner. The average lifespan of a Roman slave was approximately 17.5 years, compared to around 40 years for free Roman citizens. That single statistic contains more human suffering than any amount of historical prose can convey. The Romans enslaved people from every corner of the world they touched, from Britain and Germany in the north, from Egypt and North Africa and Ethiopia in the south, from Greece, Syria, Judea, Persia in the east. Slavery in Rome was not organized along racial lines in the way that later European and American slavery was. The Romans enslaved people of every ethnicity, including other Italians, and Roman slaves came from every background imaginable. A Gallic farmer captured in Caesar's campaigns, a Greek scholar bought in the market at Delos, a Syrian merchant's son taken as a hostage, an Italian citizen who fell into debt so severe that they lost their freedom. The routes into slavery were many, and none of them required any particular characteristic other than misfortune. The wealthiest Romans owned slaves in extraordinary numbers. Pliny the Younger, a wealthy aristocrat and writer of the 1st century CE, owned over 4,000 slaves. An ordinary middle-class Roman family might own 1 to 3. Even relatively poor Romans might own a single slave, because slave labor was so deeply embedded in the Roman economy that managing without it placed you at a significant practical disadvantage. The slave worked. In the fields, in the mines, in the household, in the workshop, in the bakery, on the docks, on the construction sites, in the baths, in the schools. Every sector of the Roman economy ran on enslaved labor, and the lifestyle that free Romans considered normal, the bread, the garum, the baths, the clean streets, the heated homes, was made possible in whole or in significant part by people who had no choice in the matter. This is the foundation of everything else in this story. It cannot be forgotten. But within that dark foundation, there was a complexity that makes Roman slavery historically distinctive, and that complexity begins with a single Latin word: peculium. The peculium was a practice by which a master allowed a slave to manage a sum of money or a set of assets as if they were the slave's own. While legally the peculium belonged to the master, it was considered the enslaved person's property in practice and could be used to purchase freedom. Think about what this meant in practice. A slave who was skilled, trusted, and given the opportunity to manage a peculium could, over years of careful accumulation, save enough money to buy their own freedom from their owner. Not guaranteed, not common, not fair, because the risk was entirely on the slave's side, the master legally able to revoke the arrangement at any moment. But possible, genuinely documented in the historical record possible. And when it happened, when a slave walked through the legal ceremony of manumission, kneeling before the magistrate, being touched on the shoulder with the rod, being handed the pileus, the soft conical cap that was the symbol of a freed person, something extraordinary occurred. In the Roman legal system, the moment of manumission transformed a slave into a Roman citizen. Not a second-class citizen, not a tolerated outsider, but a citizen with the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to contract a legal marriage, the right to appear in court, the right to pursue a trade or business under their own name. A male slave who had been legally manumitted by a Roman citizen enjoyed not only passive freedom from ownership, but active political freedom, libertas, including the right to vote. The freed person took the family name of their former master, which immediately inserted them into a network of social connections and obligations. The former master became their patron, still holding authority over the freedman in certain ways, still able to require specific services, but also providing protection, connections, and social legitimacy in return. Freedmen were an important part of what historians have called the most economically active and innovative entrepreneurial class in the Roman Empire. The children of freedmen were born fully free. No stigma of origin, no legal reminder of what their parents had been. A freedman's son could join the Roman legions, could rise through municipal government, could accumulate wealth, could, in theory and sometimes in practice, reach levels of status that their parents could only imagine. The legendary founding of Rome itself, according to the historian Livy, involved Romulus establishing a place of refuge that attracted mostly former slaves, vagabonds, and runaways, all looking for a fresh start, which Livy considered a source of Rome's strength. The story says something real about how Romans understood their city, as a place where origins mattered less than what you did with your freedom once you had it. This is not to minimize the reality of what preceded freedom. The path to manumission was long, unpredictable, and available only to a minority of Rome's enslaved population. Freedmen are overrepresented in the texts and inscriptions that survive from the time, keen to erect memorials broadcasting their freedom and citizenship. 80% of ancient funerary inscriptions found in Ostia belong to freedmen, creating a picture of great social mobility which is only partly true. These are only the people who obtained freedom and were successful enough to display their newly acquired status. The vast majority, the agricultural slaves, the mine workers, the people doing the hardest and most dangerous labor, left no inscriptions because they did not survive long enough to leave them. The ladder was real, but it had a very narrow entrance, and most people never reached the first rung. Ndihum, Marcus, our freedman copyist from the Aventine, was one of the ones who made it. He was born a slave in a household that valued literacy. His master was a man of moderate wealth who ran a small business drafting legal documents and correspondence, and who discovered, when Marcus was perhaps 8 years old, that the boy had an unusual facility with letters. He was taught to read, taught to write, taught the conventions of legal Latin and the formats of commercial correspondence and the specific calligraphic style that made documents look authoritative and trustworthy. He became useful, genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably useful. The kind of skilled slave whose abilities gave them a degree of protection that brute labor never provided. His master didn't beat him. His master worked him hard, but that work was done sitting at a writing table in a reasonably warm room, and the comparative comfort of that was not lost on Marcus, who knew perfectly well what the alternative looked like. He was given a peculium at 20, a small one, enough to begin, not enough to feel secure. He added to it carefully year by year, taking on extra copy work in the evenings and weekends, copying letters and documents for clients his master didn't have time for, keeping meticulous track of every coin. At 32, he approached his master. The negotiation was not comfortable. His master drove a harder bargain than Marcus had hoped. The final price consumed nearly everything Marcus had saved. 12 years of careful accumulation, gone in a single transaction. He walked out of the magistrate's office on a winter morning with the pileus in his hand and almost nothing else. Free, broke, 32 years old, starting over. He still wears the pileus on festival days, not constantly, not performatively, but on the days that call for it, a reminder of what the cap means, what it cost. The social position of the freedman in Rome was genuinely complicated. Legally, the transformation was complete and real. Socially, it was messier. Freedmen were barred from holding the career-track magistracies or state priesthoods in the city of Rome, and could not achieve senatorial rank. They could vote, but they could not run for high office. They could accumulate wealth, but certain doors of the Roman establishment remained permanently closed to them, regardless of how much money they had or how many generations their family had been free. And there was the stigma. The commonly held view among the Roman elite was that slavery had conferred a kind of moral taint that manumission removed legally, but could not remove socially. Petronius, the satirist, captured this attitude with cruel precision in his novel The Satyricon, whose central character is Trimalchio, a fabulously wealthy freedman who throws an extravagant dinner party and cannot stop reminding his guests of how far he has come, who goes to elaborate lengths to display his culture and refinement, and who is mocked throughout by the free-born narrator for being vulgar, excessive, and fundamentally unable to acquire the effortless dignity that only birth provides. Trimalchio is a grotesque caricature, but he is a caricature of a real anxiety, the anxiety of the person who has made it, but cannot stop worrying about whether the people around them can tell they made it, cannot quite relax into their wealth and freedom the way the people who were born into it relax. The Romans had a word for this anxiety too. They always had a word for everything. At the other end of the spectrum from Eurysaces and Trimalchio were the imperial slaves. The emperor's household, The familia Caesaris was enormous, comprising thousands of enslaved and freed people who ran the practical machinery of governing an empire. Secretaries and accountants and archivists and messengers and administrators of every kind, many of them slaves or freedmen, running offices that managed the finances and correspondence and legal proceedings of an entity that spanned 3 continents. Imperial slaves had access to education and training that was not available to most other slaves, and many were able to rise through the ranks to become trusted advisors and confidants of the emperor. An imperial slave with the right skills and the right relationship with the right people could accumulate influence that free citizens of much higher formal rank could not match. There are documented cases of imperial freedmen who effectively ran departments of the Roman government, whose decisions shaped policy, whose access to the emperor made them the most important people in the room, despite their legal status as former property. Power in Rome did not always flow through the channels that the formal hierarchy suggested. It flowed through access, through information, through the person who controlled what the emperor read, who he saw, which documents reached his desk and in what order. An imperial slave who managed those flows was, in practical terms, more powerful than most senators. This was not lost on the senators, who resented it bitterly and complained about it constantly in their correspondence, leaving us a rich written record of their indignation that is, across 2,000 years, both historically valuable and extremely funny. Nels, let's talk about the tomb of Ulysses one more time. Because it is not just the monument of a wealthy freed baker, it is a statement, a deliberate, carefully considered, architecturally permanent statement about identity and the right to be remembered. Ulysses did not build a tomb that looked like the tombs of senators or aristocrats, with their Greek columns and their carefully composed reliefs of military triumph or philosophical virtue. He built a tomb that looked like a bakery. His relief sculpture shows the entire bread-making process, the grinding of the grain, the kneading of the dough, the shaping of the loaves, the loading of the oven, the counting of the finished bread for delivery to the state. He is saying, "This is what I did. This is where I came from and what I built. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm not going to perform aristocracy for people who would never accept me as an aristocrat anyway. I am Ulysses. I made bread. I made enough bread to build this. Look at it. It is still standing. 2,000 years later, in a city that has seen empires rise and fall, that has been sacked and rebuilt and transformed a dozen times over, on a street where millions of people now walk every year without knowing his name, the tomb of a freed slave who became a baker still stands. His name is still legible. Ulysses. The night has settled over Rome now. In the insula on the Aventine, Marcus is at his small table, a single oil lamp casting its warm, uncertain light across a fresh piece of papyrus. He is not working. The lamplight is too poor for the fine copywork he does by day. He is writing a letter to an old friend who lives in Puteoli, on the Bay of Naples, a man he knew in the years before his manumission, who moved south a decade ago to work in the harbour there. The letter is easy and informal, written in the unpretentious hand he uses when no one is paying for elegance. He describes the city, the weather, a case he heard about at the forum this week that everyone is talking about. He mentions that the garum vendor near his building has raised his prices again, and this is an outrage. He asks after his friend's children. He writes slowly, because there is no hurry and the lamplight is gentle and the street outside is quiet for once. The wagon hour has not yet begun. And writing to someone you have known for 20 years, when you have the time to do it properly, is one of the specific pleasures that he has learned to protect and keep. He seals the letter with a small lump of wax, pressed with a plain ring he had made the year after his manumission. His own name in the wax. Not his master's name, not his patron's name, his, Marcus, just Marcus. He sets the letter aside to send in the morning. He blows out the lamp. In the dark room, the city rumbles on outside, distant, continuous, alive. He closes his eyes, free. There is a moment, a specific, dateable, historically documented moment, when something extraordinary happened in the city of Rome. It was the year 410 CE. On the night of August 24th, the gates of the city were opened, not by the Roman authorities, not by an agreement or a surrender or a negotiated peace. The exact circumstances are still debated by historians. Some ancient accounts suggest treachery from within. Others point to the simple exhaustion of a city that had been blockaded twice in 2 years, its people running out of food, its defenses hollowed out by decades of political instability, and the slow withdrawal of the legions that had once made its walls irrelevant. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result was the same. The Visigoths entered Rome. For 3 days, Alaric's forces moved through the city. The looting was selective. Churches were largely spared, the Visigoths being Christian themselves, but gold, silver, silk, and other treasures disappeared into the hands of the conquerors. Ordinary Romans suffered greatly, losing property and security, while aristocrats begged for mercy. Many senators hid wealth in cisterns or fled the city entirely, and then, as suddenly as they had come, the Visigoths left. They moved south. They had what they wanted. They had no particular interest in occupying Rome. It was a symbol, not a strategic prize in the way cities had once been strategic prizes. The walls were still standing. The population was still there. The baths still worked. The bread was still being baked, the garum still being sold, the lawyers still arguing in the courts. But something had broken that could not be unbroken. Rome had been sacked. The city that for 800 years had considered itself the center of the world, the eternal city, the city that conquered rather than being conquered. That city had been entered by enemies, looted, and humiliated. The psychological shock outweighed the physical destruction. Rome's monuments survived, but the image of an invincible empire was shattered permanently. St. Augustine, sitting in his study in North Africa as news of the sack reached him, began writing the book that would become one of the most influential works of Christian theology, The City of God. His argument, Rome's earthly fall was irrelevant compared to God's eternal city. The true civilization was not the one built in marble and concrete on the banks of the Tiber. It was the one built in faith. This argument shaped the next 1,000 years of European thought. It was also, in a way that Augustine probably didn't intend, exactly right. Let's be honest about how Rome ended, not in a single dramatic moment, not with a decisive battle or a final catastrophe that switched the lights off and left darkness. As the empire disintegrated in the 5th century, it became ever more difficult for many, and impossible for a great number, to eke out a living. It ended the way most things end, gradually then suddenly, in different places at different speeds, with enormous variation between what life was like in one province and what it was like in another. The western half of the empire had been fragmenting since the 3rd century, when the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of near-continuous civil war, military usurpations, plague, and economic collapse, nearly destroyed the entire structure in one catastrophic generation. The emperors who stabilized things afterward did so by transforming the empire into something increasingly different from what it had been. More militarized, more bureaucratic, more heavily taxed, less free. The baths still worked, the bread still came, but the easy confidence of the height of the empire, the Antonine golden age of the 2nd century, when Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations and Trajan's column rose above Rome, and the ordinary person in an insula on the Aventine could reasonably feel that they lived in the best-governed civilization the world had ever produced. That confidence was gone and did not come back. At its height, the city of Rome itself was home to 1 million people. A few centuries after its fall, it plunged to a nadir of barely 30,000, from 1,000,000 to 30,000. Stand in what had been the Forum Romanum in the 7th century CE, and you would find cows grazing between fallen columns. The great basilicas were roofless, their marble stripped for building material. The aqueducts that had brought clean water to 1,000,000 people had been cut during the sieges of the 5th century and never fully repaired. The baths that the city had built and maintained and subsidized as a democratic gift to its population were cold and empty. The stepping stones across the Forum, set so precisely for the width of a cartwheel, were buried under centuries of accumulated debris. The garum shops were gone. The sausage vendor was gone. The wagon wheels on stone at 3 in the morning were gone. Just silence and grass and cows. And yet the city did not die. It transformed. It became something else. The marble was repurposed into churches. The Pantheon, that extraordinary domed temple to all the gods, built in its current form by Hadrian in the 2nd century, still standing today in a state of preservation that defies both time and physics, was converted to a Christian church in 609 CE, and it is precisely this conversion that saved it. Sacred Christian buildings were maintained. Pagan temples were allowed to crumble. The Pantheon survived because it became a church, and it survives today because it became a tourist attraction, and the chain of transformations that kept it standing across 14 centuries is itself a kind of miracle. The eastern half of the empire never fell. Constantinople, the city that Constantine had built on the Bosphorus in the 4th century as a second capital, strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, continued as the center of what its inhabitants called the Roman Empire for another 1,000 years after the fall of the West. They called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek. Their legal system was Roman law. Their emperors carried Roman titles. The last of them, Constantine VI, died fighting on the walls of Constantinople in 1453. 1,000 years after the Western Empire had nominally ended, still calling himself Emperor of the Romans, still defending a city that had been Roman since the 4th century. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the scholars and intellectuals who fled west, carrying with them the texts and traditions of a civilization that had preserved Greek and Roman knowledge through the medieval period, helped ignite the Italian Renaissance. The rediscovery of classical antiquity that transformed European art, architecture, philosophy, and science in the 15th and 16th centuries was made possible in part by the fall of a city that its inhabitants called Rome. Rome ended. Rome never ended. Rome became everything that came after it. Let's count what they left us, not the monuments, the Pantheon, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the roads that still underlie European highways 2,000 years later. Those are obvious. What they left that is less obvious but more pervasive. Roman law and republican politics have left an enduring legacy, influencing the Italian city-state republics of the medieval period, as well as the United States and other modern democratic republics. The structure of a trial, judge, plaintiff, defendant, evidence, argument, verdict is Roman. The very concept of innocent until proven guilty is Roman. The Latin terminology still used in law courts today, habeas corpus, subpoena, affidavit, bona fide, is the language of Roman lawyers arguing cases in the Basilica of the Forum 2,000 years ago. The Julian calendar of ancient Rome formed the basis of the standard modern Gregorian calendar, the months you use to organize your life. January from Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, March from Mars, the god of war, June from Juno, the queen of the gods, are Roman months, carrying Roman divine associations into a world that has almost entirely forgotten what those names meant. The languages. Latin died as a spoken everyday tongue sometime in the early medieval period, fragmenting into the regional dialects that became, over centuries, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, and the other Romance languages. But Latin itself never entirely disappeared. It remained the language of the church, of scholarship, of law, of medicine, of science for well over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. The scientific names of every species of plant and animal on Earth are Latin. The inscriptions on the walls of government buildings across the Western world are Latin. The motto of the United States Senate, E pluribus unum, out of many one, is Latin. When the US government was building its capital, they looked to ancient Rome as a model for what a capital city should look like. The Capitol building that houses the government is a perfect example of Roman architectural style. The dome, the columns, the open civic space. Washington, D.C. is, in its bones, a Roman city, built by people who had studied Rome so thoroughly that they could not help building in its image. And then there is concrete. Roman concrete, opus caementitium, was one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a material so durable that structures built with it 2,000 years ago are still standing, while modern concrete begins to degrade after decades. The secret was pozzolana, volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli near Naples, which reacted with seawater in a chemical process that actually strengthened the concrete over time rather than weakening it. The Romans used this material to build harbour walls, domes, foundations, and the infrastructure of a civilization. The formula was lost after the fall. It was only rediscovered by material scientists in the 21st century. We spent 2,000 years building with inferior concrete because we had forgotten what the Romans knew. The graffiti. Let's end with the graffiti. Because all of the above, the legal systems, the calendars, the architecture, the concrete, is important and true and real, but it is also grand, and Rome at its most human was not grand. Rome, at its most human, was scratched on a wall in a back street of Pompeii by someone who had a few minutes and something they needed to say. The walls of Pompeii, preserved by the same eruption that destroyed the city, are covered in writing. Tens of thousands of individual inscriptions, catalogued by scholars over 2 centuries of excavation, constitute the largest single archive of ancient graffiti in existence. Election notices, advertisements, announcements of gladiatorial games, the names of winners of chariot races, business notices, and the personal ones. A man who writes on a wall near the Forum that he has been waiting for his girlfriend for 6 days and she hasn't come. His frustration is palpable across 2,000 years. Someone has written under it, in a different hand, what appears to be a sympathetic comment, a list of drinking companions with the note that they drank together until dawn, a philosopher's inscription on a tavern wall, "If you are well, that is good. I am well too." Love declarations, insults, boasts, complaints. A child's attempt to write the alphabet, a drawing of a gladiator with the word hero beside it, 2 people arguing in writing about who owes whom money, their exchange preserved in stone, their names and the amount in dispute and the date all carefully recorded. A dispute that ended with the eruption of Vesuvius, definitively and permanently unsettled. Across the Roman world, people left their marks on walls, monuments, and public spaces. These writings and drawings captured moments of humor, love, anger, and daily life. They were leaving evidence, not for us, not with any thought that future people would read their words and feel something. They wrote because they had something to say in that moment, and the wall was there. And the walls of Pompeii happened to be preserved by 17 feet of volcanic ash for 2,000 years. The impulse, the need to put your name somewhere, to say I was here, to leave a mark that says this specific person, in this specific moment, felt this specific thing. That impulse is not Roman. It is human. It is the same impulse that made a prehistoric person press their hand against a cave wall in paint 40,000 years ago. The same impulse that makes people carve their names into trees, into bridge railings, into the concrete of school desks. The same impulse that drives someone at 3 in the morning to post something into the vast digital wall of the internet, not because anyone asked for it, but because the feeling was there and it needed to go somewhere. I was here. I felt this. Remember me. Marcus is old now, not ancient. In his early 60s, which in Rome is old enough to know it. His hand has the slight tremor that comes from 40 years of fine copywork, a tremor he manages by resting his wrist carefully on the edge of the writing table, compensating with the steadiness of his palm what his fingers can no longer provide alone. He works less than he used to. A younger copyist, a freedman's son he trained himself, handles the larger commissions. He sits on the bench outside his building in the late afternoon. The building is the same building, different rooms, better rooms, the 3rd floor now rather than the 4th. One small improvement at a time over 3 decades. The neighborhood is the same. The fountain 2 buildings down is the same fountain, its water still flowing from the aqueduct that has supplied this part of Rome for 100 years. He is watching the street, not waiting for anything, not going anywhere. Just watching, the way old people watch streets they have known for decades, seeing both the present and the accumulated past simultaneously. The ghost of every previous version of this street overlaid on the current one. The baker across the way is the grandson of the baker. He knew when he first came to this street as a young freed man with a pileus and nothing else. The wine bar on the corner has changed hands 4 times, but the stone counter is the same stone counter, and the amphorae on the shelf behind it are the same shape they have always been. A child runs through the street, then another, chasing the first. A cart horse waits patiently at the end of the block, its driver inside a warehouse negotiating a delivery. The smell of garlic and olive oil from an open window. The sound of argument from 2 floors above, familiar and unthreatening. The same couple who have been having variations of the same argument for as long as Marcus can remember. The Tiber, invisible from here but audible on quiet evenings, moving in its ancient bed. He is a small man in a large city, in a vast empire, and none of that empire knows his name, and that is entirely fine, because the empire's knowing his name was never the point. The point was the 4th floor room and the pileus and the careful hand, and the letters written, and the garum and the baths, and the wine watered to the right proportion, and the friend in Puteoli who still writes back. The point was the life. Just the life. The late afternoon light on the stone of the street, the child who disappeared around the corner and came back again, the cart horse, patient and enormous, waiting, Rome, ordinary and magnificent, going on. Dies ist You've been here for a while now, through the noise and the smoke of the insula, through the thermopolium counter and the smell of garum, through the warm air of the tepidarium and the cold shock of the frigidarium, through the Forum and the law courts and the Aventine Hill at twilight, through the slave markets and the ceremony of manumission and the tomb of a freed baker that has outlasted emperors. And now here, in the quiet of a late afternoon, watching a street that is both 2,000 years ago and somehow entirely now. That is what Rome does to you, if you let it. It makes the past feel close. It makes the distance between then and now feel negotiable. Not erased, not pretended away, but crossed, bridged. You on one side, Marcus on the other, and between you nothing but time, which is, in the end, the most permeable of all barriers. Because the things that connected Marcus to his world are the same things that connect you to yours. A place to sleep that is yours. Work that uses your particular skills. Food that tastes like home. Friends who write back. The specific quality of late afternoon light on a familiar street. These things have not changed. They will not change. Not in another 2,000 years. Not ever. Sleep well. Utile, before you go. If you made it all the way here, through the insulae and the garum, and the baths and the graffiti, and all the way to Marcus sitting on his bench in the late afternoon light, then you are exactly the person this channel was made for. Thank you, genuinely. It means everything that you were here. If this story kept you company tonight, the single best thing you can do to help us keep making stories like this one is to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, if you haven't already. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from right now. It doesn't have to be long, just a city, a country, a time zone. We read every single one. We're building something here, a library of long, slow, deeply researched journeys into the real lives of ordinary people across history. Ancient Egypt is already waiting for you in the archive. Ancient Rome is now complete. Coming soon, the real daily life of medieval peasants, the extraordinary world that the Black Death left behind, the Ottoman Empire at its height, feudal Japan, and more. Every story is the same in its purpose, not kings, not battles, not the grand sweep of official history. The people underneath all of that. The ones who ground the grain and baked the bread and wrote on the walls and loved their families and got into disputes with their neighbors that lasted 11 years. The ordinary ones, the ones who built everything. They deserve to be remembered. And here at Sleepy History Tales, that is exactly what we do. Good night. We'll see you in the next one.